a summer that has been devastating. Devastating for people in sub-Saharan Africa, who are now in their third year of drought, and whom are wondering if drought is simply going to be the new reality. For people in Asia and Europe who have been devastated by unusual and unseasonable floods, and devastating for people right here in North America and South America, hit by heat death and by bushfires. Last week, we had the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, tell us that climate breakdown is now irreversible and that we are hurtling towards catastrophe. And this week, as governments and politicians gear up for a new election, all they can talk about is getting back to business as usual. We know it's going to be calamity, and yet nobody's talking about it. The media aren't asking the questions, and the reason that this isn't in our conversation is that the people in power, our political elites, media moguls, and corporate billionaires, are the people for whom business as usual works. So I'm going to start today by simply telling the truth, which is in itself now a radical act, and grounding us in why this movement and this crisis is beyond serious. Because while all the people in power would like very much for us to believe that this is economically and politically very complicated, the simple physical thermodynamic reality is very simple. And it's a bit like going to the doctors and saying, oh, I've got this very complicated problem with the knee, and the doctor tells you, well, we're not quite sure how to solve that, what medicines to give you. And you've got this complicated migraine, not quite sure what's causing it, not sure how to solve it quite. But the doctor also tells you that you've got cancer. And once you hear that fact, the killer fact, the complicated other stuff doesn't matter anymore. The dodgy knee, the migraine, it doesn't matter if something else is simply going to kill you. And at that point, no matter how radical the therapy is, you simply have to do it to avoid death. And there's a couple of killer facts in the climate crisis and ecological crisis that I want to ground us in. They're very simple, just physics. And the first one is about where we're heading. Because you might have heard about the Paris Climate Agreement. And I'm going to put to you today that that agreement might be the single greatest example of a self-delusion in human history. Because it is based on the idea that we need to stick below 2 degrees of warming. They're not wrong. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us for over 6 years that 2 degrees of warming would be a disaster on a scale far surpassing the coronavirus climate crisis of the last year and a half. But the simple fact of the matter is that 2 degrees is already locked in. And I'll give you a couple of basic reasons why. Not complicated, high school science students can understand them. And the first reason comes down to this idea called carbon lag. Because it turns out when you put carbon into the atmosphere, it doesn't immediately heat up the planet. It takes about 20 to 30 years for the carbon to have a resultant impact on our global average temperature, which means that even if we were to turn off the taps tomorrow, simply stop polluting our atmosphere and stop emitting carbon altogether, we would still have the last 20 to 30 years of carbon output coming down the pipes. the most intensive pollution in our history. And peer-reviewed, scientifically published papers and well-accepted science now suggests that the number that that's going to add to our existing 1.1 degree of warming is 0.7. So 1.1, 0.7, my maths isn't fantastic, but that's 1.8. And number two is this idea called global dimming. And what that means is that over the last 200 years, we've been polluting our atmosphere with CO2, but also a lot of other chemicals that now sit in our atmosphere like a blanket and shield us from a lot of the sun's rays. And once we turn off that carbon tap, all the pollution subsides, and suddenly those rays are able to come in and warm our planet even further. And again, well-accepted science and peer-reviewed papers put that number at an additional 0.7 degrees. So 1.8, 0.7, that's 2.5. Far above the Paris Climate Agreement's maximum threshold. And even if we're a little bit wobbly on those figures, even if we're a bit off, 10 degrees here, 10 degrees there, we're still at 2. At 2 degrees of warming, you get 4 degrees in the middle of continents. At 4 degrees in the middle of continents, grain farming becomes simply unsustainable on an industrial scale. If you can't grow grains, that means one thing: mass starvation. But that's also completely irrelevant, because the agreement sets 2 degrees as a limit of safety, but what we've actually agreed to will put us at 3.2 degrees of warming. If we keep to all of our agreements as they stand today, we are simply going to reach 3.2. But I've also not taken into account one final factor, which is humans. Because we haven't just turned off the tap. In fact, we're not even close. We aren't coming down in our carbon emissions. We haven't plateaued. We're not even keeping on the same upward trajectory. We, for the last 5 years, have been increasing the rate at which we put carbon into the atmosphere. So regardless of what promises our governments are making us, regardless of what projections we would get to with the Paris Climate Agreement, the simple fact is where we're heading right now is 4 degrees of warming. At 4 degrees of warming, by the end of this century, you get 8 degrees in the middle of continents, and you get 24 degrees on a hot day. At 8 degrees, all industrial agriculture simply becomes unsustainable. Anybody who's ever tried to grow outdoor vegetables knows it's virtually impossible to do above 30 degrees. And you only need to be at those temperatures for 3 months of the year to have a famine. So that's the physical basis, but then if you look at historical precedents and you look at social science, if you're going to have mass starvation because you can't grow enough food, we know that that leads to one thing: social collapse. It's not political, it's not economic, it's simple agriculture and historical precedent. Social collapse, which means war, mass displacement, and migration. And that's where we're heading. So, first killer fact, we're heading towards disaster and social collapse, and we're putting our foot literally on the gas pedal. Shame. But the second reality is that the way we experience this is going to be highly non-linear. And this is the simple reason why there aren't 10,000 people here today rather than the number that we have, which is amazing, and it's lovely to see so many new faces. And we all understand this idea because we've been through the pandemic. We understand the idea that by the time you're experiencing the threat in the hospitals, it's already too late. You've locked in the disastrous outcome that you were worried about. And you don't need to look much further for an example of this in our climate process than Lytton. Because when the people in the community of Lytton woke up at the start of the heat dome, they didn't anticipate that by the end of that week, they wouldn't have a community to go back to. They didn't anticipate that by the end of the week, they would be living in one of the hottest places on Earth, in temperatures 7 degrees below the hottest temperature ever recorded on our planet. And they didn't see that because by the time you see the dam leaking, it's simply too late. The people of Lytton had 15 minutes from the moment that they spotted smoke on that day to the moment when they had to evacuate because flames were at their town doors. And it's the simple reality that this is not going to be a crisis which gets slowly worse and worse every year. You aren't going to experience slowly rising temperatures. It's not going to become gradually more uncomfortable. It's going to become a little uncomfortable and then you're going to be dead. It's going to hit the wet bulb effect in Asia, and we're going to have 3 million dead people in Karachi. It's going to be a storm that stops on your city and devastates it. It's going to be a bushfire that starts and comes through before you can react. And if that scares you, if it gives you grief or anxiety, then simply welcome to the club. I find this terrifying. But it's important that we accept the fact that that is a rational and proportionate response to reality and to the truth. And it can feel daunting, but my mum told me something I think very wise, which is not unusual for her, but she told me recently that grief is simply love with nowhere to go. It's what happens when you have all that love bottled up for somebody who you simply can't give it to anymore. And what I'm going to do now is invite Zain up, because here in Extinction Rebellion, we take our grief and we've head all of that love into tactics. And I'd like to invite Zain over to talk about how that works now. Thank you.